Hey. So Bill, it's a great pleasure to be doing this session with you because you are one of the multiple masters of scale. With Microsoft, then the foundation, the problems that you tackle, global health, climate change, which we're talking about today. And you know, we figured we might as well just dive right into it. One of the things that obviously is, you know, we see emissions continuing to grow. We're working on that a lot. Why is net zero so important?
Well, the basic physics are that the more greenhouse gases there are, the more you warm the Earth. And therefore, the weather conditions for the current ecosystems become very difficult. For example, you won't be able to work outdoors during the summer in equatorial regions. You won't be able to grow the crops we grow today. Weather disasters will be quite extreme. And that every emission you make, you know, the CO2 has a half-life of about 10,000 years. And so you can almost think of it as the sum over time is what you're facing with this problem. And it's very daunting because any number greater than zero, the temperature just keeps going up, and it means zero from every country and from every sector of emissions. So very different than saying, okay, let's reduce it 20% or 30%.
And what's the level of risk that there is some nonlinear curve here, that when you get to some point, it just starts getting worse at a greater than linear rate?
Well, there are a few positive feedback loops, like when the tundra's melting or the icy lakes up in that tundra region are melting, that you get a lot of methane release that comes out of that. So there's a number of things that as you melt ice, you know, ice is white, the ocean is not white, and so there's a positive reinforcement loop. Weirdly, CO2 itself only raises the temperature a little bit, but then as it raises the temperature, it causes more water to get into the atmosphere. Water is the ultimate greenhouse gas. Most of the forcing comes because there'll be more water. And that's this multiplying factor of you take the CO2, and it's not CO2 times 1, it's CO2 times something like 2.6. So yes, there's very little that dampens this effect. And in the history of the Earth, it's gone through these big swings, and you have massive species extinction as you go through these swings, and we're kind of not keen on that.
So yes, so given the baseline numbers of this, why are we doing such a bad job of this? What are the things that are in our way?
Well, we built the world we take for granted based on hydrocarbon energy. The progress among mankind is a progress. Why is the Industrial Revolution special? Why have these last 200 years been very different than the years that came before that? It's the discovery that we can have energy working for us. Transport, materials, fertilizer, you know, all the things that we simply take for granted. All of that infrastructure has to be replaced with a way of, hopefully, providing the same services, but doing it without emissions. And so, you know, people tend to think of electricity and transport. That's not a third of emissions. The factories that build things, cement, steel, agriculture, heating and cooling buildings, those are the areas where you get to that 100%. And so, you know, people who really understand the scale of this thing, people like Václav Smil, who's the best author of what we face here, they're like, really? You know, have you looked at the numbers? Do you know the numbers? And most people don't want to make that much of a sacrifice. Going to, say, voters in France and say, hey, we put a diesel tax on for the climate, the people who live outside the city are like, hey, we're not as rich as the people in the city, and that's the yellow vest phenomenon, and that tax didn't last very long. And so the idea that there's pain today, real serious dislocation pain, and it's to a benefit that's really fairly abstract and way out there in the future in terms of the steps we take today are not going to, the mitigation we do today won't really change the next 15 years. That heating, there's a lag time, so that sadly, the mitigation, which means reducing the emissions, in parallel, we have to do what weirdly they call adaptation, which is helping people deal with these negative effects. So the fact that it's global in nature and you can be a free rider, if the other people get rid of 90% and you keep your 10%, you are way better off. And these delays and the scale of the cost, it makes it far more difficult than any problem mankind has ever dealt with. And it's got this weird deadline. You don't get to say, hey, innovators, go innovate and let us know how it's going. Nominally, you have to invent things and start to scale them and make them economic and be done globally by 2050.
Yeah, we'll get back to innovation because it's one of the 2 or 3 things we have as hope. But, right now, obviously, we're having war, we're having pandemic, we're having, all these things. And that could cause people to get extra discouraged when they get to climate. What's the kind of like, look, we desperately need to work on this, but what's the perspective in these troubled times that you would offer?
Well, certainly, if you take the overall goals that the United Nations set, which are called the Sustainable Development Goals, the Gates Foundation has yearly, as part of that UN General Assembly meeting, we have a day called the Goalkeepers Day, where we call people in and we highlight exemplars, people who are getting ahead of the goals, and we talk about some things that are falling behind. As of today, the world is behind on every single goal that we set for 2030. Now, of course, some were kind of aspirational, but none of them anticipated we'd have a pandemic, which would lead to a lot of deficits, which would lead to a turn of the economic cycle with high inflation, high interest rates that go with that, and now a war that is massively affecting the global economy. I mean, it's horrific in Ukraine, but in Africa, say, half as much fertilizer is being used this year because of the price increases last year, and they didn't use a quarter as much as they should use last year. And so the pain is being sent out across the world. And so it's particularly hard to say to people right now, oh, you should pay extra for your electricity, your travel, your food, when you already have that inflationary pressure. And we have a movement whose primary metric has been near-term emissions reductions, say 2030 type goals. And none of those goals by country, by sector, they will not be hit. And so if that's your primary metric, it's easy to say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Maybe we have to be even more radical. Well, the long lead time item is the innovation. And so the dream state for all areas of emissions is that you can invent some way of providing the same capability, say make cement or make steel, but do it so that the cost is no greater than it is today. And that differential of today's costs and the clean process, that's called the green premium. And so a way to state this is that we have to drive green premiums to zero. Now, so since 2015, there's been, through Breakthrough Energy and a lot of partners and a lot of brilliant people, money's going in to every one of those sectors to fund companies and brilliant people whose goal it is within each area that they have an idea that can drive that premium to zero. And I'm very lucky because I get to work with those people at the early stage and see in the lab that, wow, you can make steel that way? Who thought you could? And things like steel and cement, you don't go to these conferences much and hear about the latest in steel and cement. I mean, it's not as cool as entertainment, say. And, it was kind of a solved problem until climate comes along and tells you, hey, please start over. But I will say that the breakthrough energy companies, and that goes back to 2015 when I started that as the climate platform, they have over 100 companies. There's, say, 50 other companies I know of also doing incredible work. So you've got like 150 companies, which will become 300 over the next 2 or 3 years, that even with a very high failure rate, we should have a path to get those green premiums down. So to me, that's kind of the leading indicator because 65% of emissions aren't in rich countries. They're in middle-income countries. And there's not enough money in the world to subsidize the middle-income countries to go the clean approach. Unless you have a zero green premium, no way. The thing only scales, because the subsidy cost would be 10 times the total foreign aid budgets of all the rich countries today. So you need this enabling factor before you can hope that you get it out. So rich countries owe us 2 things with the US in the lead. We have to get rid of our emissions. That's about 25% of all emissions, all rich countries. And you have to invent things that, as they get scaled, like solar or lithium ion, get you to this zero green premium. So I'm hopeful, that was a long way of answering, that, there is a path here. People get pretty depressed as we miss the short-term goals, or as they realize that, paying $3 a ton to plant trees is a joke. It doesn't do anything. There's a lot of dead ends in this space, but now that we have innovation power starting to ramp up, I'm reasonably optimistic.
Yep. No, and so like shifting to some of the optimism. You just came here from the Breakthrough Summit, and it's one of those times where on this just otherwise like, oh shit, how big is this issue? You reported it was great. So say some things about what was going on at the summit.
Yeah, I'd say there's 2 things that have happened this year that are really fantastic. One is that we got good policy changes in the United States. There were 3 different bills.
Yes.
And that took a lot of work by a lot of people.
Yes.
We've got the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, and then the third, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, IRA. And each of those incentivize the innovation and come up with policies and funds. This meeting that Reid mentioned was the first time we've had the whole breakthrough energy community come together. There's a lot of pieces in that platform. There's the policy group that works with all the environmental groups, that whole coalition was key to what we were able to get done on the policy piece. We have a thing called fellows, where somebody who doesn't have a business plan, but either they want to bring their management skills or their science skills, they can quit and get funded to pull something together. And then if that goes well, they become fundable. We have a venture group that has already invested several billion and will raise over the next couple of years a few more billion. We have a catalyst group, which is about these projects and funding these projects and make sure that government doesn't try and run these projects so that it's really a high-speed private sector thing, although the policies are key. And then we have a science group that does a lot of modeling things. So that platform, that breakthrough energy platform, this was the first time that we had the Secretary of Energy, John Kerry, lots of investors, big private companies coming and seeing the entrepreneurs and then, tying them up. The world's most innovative steel company, funding a still not fully proven, but likely to work, in my opinion, way of making steel. So to see that sense that that ecosystem with all the different skill sets involved was coming together and give a sense of hope to a community that, the closer you are to this thing, the more you go, wow, that is a long distance that we have to travel.
Yeah, a long distance with, as you said, a fixed timeline. And innovation usually doesn't work that way. So let's dive into a couple of the areas. One of the ones that I think most often in the world and in the US is not really well understood is reinventing fission, right? That the fact that nuclear fission is actually, in fact, really important to us. Obviously, we would love to see fusion, as much fusion as possible. That's great. But let's focus on fission. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so as we reduce the direct use of hydrocarbons, take natural gas away from electricity generation, industrial processes, heating your home, likewise take coal away, then energy has to come from somewhere. There's no free lunch here, according to the physicists. So we have to have energy sources. And we have wind and solar, but you have lots of places like Japan where you can't ever fulfill their energy needs. And even if they put up wind, they have long periods of time where you don't have wind. So ideally, in this mix, you would have non-weather dependent, totally green source of energy that can be placed where that energy load is. And there's really only two that can scale infinitely. One is nuclear fission, where you split big atoms in half and energy comes out. And then there's fusion, where you take little atoms and you stick them together and energy comes out. It's E equals MC squared type energy. So it's like, wow. Taking one atom of methane and burning it gives you 1 million times less energy than a nuclear reaction. So you're 1 million times better off, except you have waste and safety and lots of problems. So the nuclear industry, it essentially died on its third generation of products because they were too expensive. The safety was too fragile, even though the deaths per unit of energy is far better than coal or natural gas. The perception that, hey, you can have these big accidents, which in one case you really did, meant that that's a dead end. We can't just tune the third generation design. So we have to start from scratch and build something that's maybe a third the cost, no high pressure, doesn't try to compete for electricity when the sun is shining because those prices are very low. Electricity when the sun is shining is essentially a solved problem. But people who don't want to freeze to death or factories that need to run 24 hours, it's reliability is the hard part of electricity, not every once in a while it's super, super cheap. And so you have to think of it as a reliability system that faces the problem that during the extreme cases, which are cold snaps and heat waves, your renewable sources tend to not be available. So when the cold front hits the Midwest, there's no sun, there's no wind, and yet you have this non-sheddable load, which is people don't like to freeze to death. You can't thaw them out later. And so it's 24 hours a day and kind of a mind-blowing amount of energy required in that case. So having either nuclear fission, which has huge economic problems and we need breakthroughs, or fusion, which has both science problems and economic problems, these are grossly underinvested areas. Now, versus say 10 years ago, the investment level's gone up very dramatically. There's 14 fusion companies, Breakthrough Energy's in 4 out of the 14. I'm biased on fission because I directly fund, and once you put billions of dollars into something, you get bias that it might work. So I'm hoping that, I can take that money and spend it on malaria if it goes well.
Well, and look, we know that fission does work. The things we have to do is solve safety, solve scale of certain things, solve regulatory. There's a bunch of different things, but that's part of the reason why I wanted to highlight the first the technology to talk about is fission, because we know it's there, we know we're going to need it, we should be quadrupling down on it, because what else is your plan B? Fusion, we have to solve some science problems. Hopefully we will, but again, we have a time clock. This is on a time clock. So So the next area, tell us a little bit about green hydrogen.
Yeah, so hydrogen is a form of energy. It's actually very dense from a mass point of view, but it's extremely hard to make compact, and therefore it's extremely hard to move around. Liquid hydrocarbons are gasoline, is where you directly experience it, is this miracle thing that it's incredibly energy dense and it costs less than bottled water, less than orange juice. I mean, that is really cheap stuff. And we've been spoiled as we've been using that as our primary energy source for transportation. If you can make hydrogen with no emissions, green hydrogen, that actually can solve a lot of problems. So, the way steel is made, you generate a lot of heat with a special form of coal. You can actually make steel, which is this huge reduction. The thing that's out in the ground is the iron ore has these oxygens on it, and it's hard to pull them off. That's what that coal is doing. You can also do that reduction with hydrogen, or you can do it with electricity. But hydrogen is one of the paths people are spending a lot of time on. So of all the emission problems in the industrial area, almost 2/3 of them can be solved if you get green hydrogen at $1 a kilogram. Now, today it's like $6 a kilogram, so we have to scale those things up. But there are approaches that if you assume you've got very cheap electricity and a new way of doing the splitting, you either start with water or with methane. We see in Breakthrough Energy has 4 companies, and there's many others competing to get that number down very dramatically, and that can be used across many, many areas of emission. So it's very hot right now. Everybody's talking about green hydrogen, but it's a very difficult goal to achieve.
So we have a lot of leaders in the room. We have leaders on the live stream. What's the kind of top questions you would make sure these leaders are asking themselves if they were going to try to also pitch in to address these issues? And obviously, it depends on the leader and it's across a wide range. But how would you say, okay, you're talking to government people, you're talking to other industry people, you're leading a company, you're being a prominent citizen within the U.S. What would you say? Consider X, consider Y.
Well, the involvement of the private sector companies is one of the fantastic things that happened over the last 5 years. At the Glasgow Summit COP26 last November, the private sector really came, and not just the private sector that's inherently emits, which is like oil and gas or electricity or industrial. The finance sector, the technology sector, all were there saying, okay, they want to help be involved. And for many of these new green products, they can be pilot customers. When they build a new building, they can buy green cement. Yes, they'll pay a little bit extra, but that is part of that learning curve. So we need them to step up and do that. When their employees fly, they can pay an offset amount that will invest in either biofuels or getting hydrogen into the plane, 2 different paths to green air transport, and we'll get that down. So now this is kind of an all of society thing. It is deeply concerning that if you have one party in power, you do these policies, and then the other party comes in, you don't do these policies, because you're asking for a complete switch in the infrastructure, which, that scaling, even if you go at massive speeds, which we're not yet, for things like transmission that we're moving very slowly on. But if you can't see it as a policy that's going to stick, then those investments just won't get made.
So as our probably last question, one of the things we were talking about backstage when we were kind of saying what are the important themes to be here is, in these troubling times, it's very easy for the wealthy countries to forget the poor countries, right? What's the as it were, the call to arms to say, do not forget. It's so important, not just for them, but for us, for the world.
Well, from a pure moral point of view, human lives, should matter on a global basis, and sometimes we do. There's foreign aid, which is, like 0.3% of GDP. But overwhelmingly, we don't, particularly when there's a pressing problem. And, the pandemic was a huge problem. This war is a huge problem. So sadly, that means that right when these poor countries are facing high costs, and food is a big part of their budget, fuel is a big part of their budget, they're getting less. They're also experiencing the ravages of climate change because sadly, the closer you are to the equator, the worse this is. So it's been almost ironic that you have temperate zone activists, yelling about this thing. I love them. But we need tropical zone activists just from the point of view of justice because they are going to pay the price and they didn't do the emissions. And so hopefully, while we're doing climate, we're really keeping in mind the low-income countries. And there's another case we can be hopeful. In the year 2000, over 10 million children died every year. Now we're down to less than half of that. So that's innovation and generosity coming from a variety of actors that have cut that death rate in half. And so, and it didn't take, some massive sacrifice that came out of the aid money and actors like the foundation prioritizing diseases like diarrhea and pneumonia. So it's a challenge, and the movement is going to get a bit shrill as people's expectations and what gets delivered in the near term in terms of reparations and near-term reductions, we're going to fall short on that. But if you have that justice framework in mind, that innovation really, human innovation's incredible. I didn't know when I started down the breakthrough energy path whether I'd see the same innovation I'd seen in the digital realm. I really didn't. And I'm here to tell you that, wow, bright people, particularly in the United States, have come up with solutions to these problems. And it's going to be fun to back those and get those scaled out literally on a global scale.
Yeah. Huge challenge, time clock, disastrous consequences, but rays of hope with the innovation that we can put the jetpacks on.
All right.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
What's said at the summit stays at the summit.
Everybody will have to pay attention.
Almost no one sees this coming. Those founders are becoming more globally ambitious. They're coming after your talent, your capital, your market share.
The difficulty is when a team has been working so hard on one thing.
If you are trying to use your time and your talent and your money in the service of others, the work will never end.
We have to deal with inequities.
It's different if you're a founder, but when you walk into something so big and so perfect and so successful, it's not about me. It's about me becoming a part of it and just evolving it and making it better.
The thing that I love about it, and that makes me so optimistic, is that it's just creating more dialogue.
I'm here to tell you that, wow, human innovation's incredible.
This is Masters of Scale Summit.